to our kickoff session of ADR Vantage's Conflict Conversations. I want to thank all of you for joining us today as we celebrate Conflict Resolution Day. Today's conflict conversation is the first of what we hope will be a periodic webinars where we bring together experts and practitioners from around the field of conflict resolution to explore and discuss all the ways that we engage in and address conflict. For some sessions, we'll post a brief article to our website at adrvantage.com that explores an emerging trend that's related to the theme of conflict. We'll use that article to frame our discussion and to identify what implications that emerging trend has for those of us in the field in conflict resolution and for anyone who's experiencing conflict. So for today's discussion, we have posted an article that you can find on our website at adrvantage.com or on our LinkedIn page, and that article outlines a framework of conflict engagement. We'll use that to explore the language that we associate with conflict and how that language affects how we think about and show up in conflicts. We hope that today's conflict conversation will help you understand and even challenge your own assumptions about conflict and start to envision radically different and more effective ways of addressing it. So again, for those of us joining, I want to make a quick announcement. If you are in gallery view and you're seeing a lot of boxes for those people who are viewing live and you want to see only the panelists, you can right click on any of those boxes and you'll see a drop-down menu of non-video participants. So before we get into anything further, I want to take a moment to introduce the panel that we have with us today. So first up is Dr. Ralph Steele, who's been a mediator and an arbitrator for over 20 years, serving on mediation panels for the federal agencies like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Dr. Steele is the author of 10 books, including the title, Mediating Highly Complex Cases for International Corporations, a Model for Mediators. And he is a professor of mediation at the University of Texas in Arlington. Dr. Steele, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Rick. I'm glad to be here.
Also joining us is Dr. Nika Carstarphen, who has over 20 years of experience as an international conflict and peace-building practitioner, trainer, researcher, and evaluator. She has facilitated intergroup dialogues and problem-solving processes for over 3,700 adults and youth worldwide, and has taught in universities in Bolivia, Indonesia, Spain, Thailand, and here in the United States. Nika, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
And finally, we're joined by Sam Slosberg, who is the ADR Services Lead at the Transportation Security Administration's National Resolution Center, where he deploys professional conflict practitioners across the country to deliver conflict services to dozens of TSA airports and offices. Sam, thank you for joining us as well.
Here.
So our conversation today stems from this idea that the conflict literature often describes conflict as an opportunity for growth, for change and innovation, all things that are positive, while simultaneously acknowledging that most people don't experience it that way. In our professional world, we frame conflict as either something to be prevented, managed, or resolved. And in fact, our field of practice is called conflict resolution, alternative dispute resolution, or conflict management. So we first want to consider whether that language sets up negative associations, which then contributes to perhaps ineffective approaches to conflict. And then we'll explore whether by changing that language, we can encourage a more positive and productive approach to conflict. So let's start the conversation there. How do you see this framework of conflict resolution, prevention, and management affecting the ability of people to address their conflicts? And Nika, I'll start with you and we'll kind of go around the circle.
Okay, thank you, Rick. I think first of all, before we actually even talk about those terms that you've introduced, is to define what do we mean by conflict, because I think that's actually the crux of the problem when people have negative associations with conflict is because of the term conflict, and it has less to do with the terms around management and resolution and prevention. I mean, those terms have been in the scholarly literature well defined since the early 90s. And with each iteration of the field advancing, we come up with new terms. So first it was, alternative dispute resolution, and then it was conflict management, the assumption that, conflict is inevitable, and so we need to manage it. And then we said, well, but we need to resolve it. So the conflict resolution language came about with John Burton back in 1990, if not before, that was focused on how getting at the root causes or sources of conflict, looking at it in terms of needs and interests, et cetera, and that if we have that understanding, then we can resolve conflict. And then in the mid-90s, the language of conflict transformation actually came about by John Paul Lederach and others who were focusing more on the relational aspects of what do we do with especially intractable violent conflicts around the world, and how do we address those. So I think the scholarly literature has advanced a lot in terms of what those terms mean, and we still maybe have different understandings of it. But in terms of the issue of, do people associate conflict with a negative thing as opposed to an opportunity for growth and change and that sort of thing, I think that is related to the term conflict itself, regardless of what you put behind it.
Great, and there's a couple of points there that I want to come back to later in the conversation, specifically around the kind of what other terms we may consider, that may be more useful than the ones that we've gotten to now. So thanks, Nika. Ralph, how about for you?
Well, I think that Nika is on to something, but I also think that if you look at the educational system itself has not, in my opinion, from elementary school to all the way to the college and universities, has not done enough to impact what I call how the perception of how people understand and view conflict. And with that being said, now we're faced with a culture of negativity on conflict that, even though the literature, as Nikki said correctly, has far advanced, but that culture of conflict that stems in a deep negative perception has not changed. And so as a result of that, now the question becomes for me is, how do we, those of us who are practitioners, those of us who are professors, those of us who are mediators, and how do we impact a cultural change so we go from a culture of negativity on conflict and then transition to a culture of positivity of conflict, so that thereby people can think and understand conflict is not as a barrier, but conflict as a real opportunity for change and growth, and then the conversation that we all have from day to day between one-on-one or in groups, or even better. And now that whole perspective of culture of change is kind of spans out worldly from a global perspective. And so I think that when we impact the culture of conflict, then I think we'll have a better opportunity and we'll see a better and a greater change from conflict.
Great, and a couple of things there for us to think about, is one, just kind of the history of conflict, both societally, how we kind of maintain and think about conflict collectively over time, but also the piece around how do we move from the literature to kind of the real world and develop that culture. So thank you for that. And Sam, you work for the National Resolution Center. So how does that language of resolution prevention and management, sit with you?
So we are, for Nika's reference, we are National Resolution Center ADR services. And it's something that I've struggled with. I've been a part of this group for about 3 years, and we're always looking at kind of how we promote ourselves and how we kind of promote the services that we provide and the benefits. And I find myself putting a lot of energy into less the services and more the benefits, because quite honestly, people don't want to, I think at the organizational level here within TSA, they're afraid of conflict. They don't want to deal with it. And I think as such, they're not really putting themselves in a place, and we're not helping them get to a place where they want to embrace the potential of conflict. So we're really working on education and outreach to demonstrate the positive impacts that can come out of conflict engagement. I was fascinated by this article because it's really, as I'm thinking about, we have a new fiscal year happening and how we're going to be reaching out to some of our folks, which 50,000 people spread across 450 airports. It's a bit of a challenge. However, I think it's really important that we start kind of normalizing conflict, and that it's not something to fear, not something to run away from. Because right now it is a challenge to just get people to the table. Once they are at the table, they realize we don't bite, and we've got some good processes for them. But I think it's hard to ask for help in the current climate.
Go for it.
I really do have to add something too. Is I think when we use the term conflict, we come to that discussion with our own lenses in terms of where we work. So whether it's in organizations or in through the court system or communities, et cetera. I mean, and when I think of conflict and this work, my work is more at the community level and dealing with intergroup conflicts and people who are involved in conflicts at a big level. So whether it's dialogues between Israelis and Palestinians or Greek and Turkish Cypriots or, Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland or gangs here in the US. To say conflict is a opportunity for growth and a good thing, it's kind of a hard sell. So I often don't even use the term conflict, because if people are suffering and from violence related to conflict, then I actually try not to use the term conflict to begin with and use other terms, and I can talk about that later. But I just want to highlight that the situations that we work in also influences the language we need that we use and how we might use language and what those terms mean to the people that we're working with.
Sure, I appreciate that point, and I think the reality is that those of us in the field of practice recognize that conflict can be an opportunity, and yet, we often experience conflict in a way that does feel negative, or, particularly in those more violent or extreme circumstances. So, and yet we recognize that there's this real opportunity to shift the way that we think about it. So, from your own perspectives, what benefit is there, to what extent do you think a shift in language and how we talk about conflict could help people make a shift in their attitudes and approaches to it?
Rick, I think that that's part of what I would consider to be the core of transition to helping people and helping society and helping the global society to transition from just looking at conflict and perceiving it from a negativity to actually, now we have, with a language, as the language changes, now we have, I think that we'll have a greater sense of not only just having intervention with conflict, but having a sense of and a direction and what I would consider to be strategic and intentional ways to prevent conflict. And I don't think that enough is done in society to actually prevent conflict. In fact, I've done a lot of workshops myself around the country, and just recently, for the first time of all the conflict type of courses, the conflict prevention workshop was one of the few that was done. It was strictly just prevention, not intervention. And so even with that, it helps the language change. And the last thing I would say on it is if you look at conflict, I think one of the issues also is, how do people talk constructively when they talk about conflict? And what I mean by constructively, I'm talking about two things. If a person can talk constructively about conflict, now they have to also talk both effectively and efficiently, and that comes out of the way we think as well. It's not just we're having this conversation, but we think about conflict in a way that's different. And so even though the language changed, the thinking has to change also.
And from your perspective, Ralph, so you feel that the shift in the language supports a shift in the thinking. Is that correct?
I think so, because the language in some way molds and develops the way people think. Because the language has a level of thought and theory in it that actually aids in transition from theory to practice.
Okay. Sam, Nika, what are your thoughts around the language and whether that can help support a shift?
I think, I mean, Ralph mentioned something. It's just the idea of kind of constructive conversations, and my view very much is around this TSA world and trying to crack the nut here to help normalize the experience for folks. And we started something about 6 months ago on Partner Office that I'm partnering with and doing some facilitation called TSA Talks. And we've tackled issues around inclusion, diversity, blind spots in conversations. We're talking about, there's going to be a conversation around culture in a couple weeks. And I think what I've seen come out of that is we're talking about conflict when we're not in conflict, having the conversations when we're not kind of emotionally involved and invested, because I think it's a much different conversation when folks are in conflict or they're thinking they have a conflict and where do they reach out to and where do they go when they're in that kind of more equilibrium place where they can it just enables them to have a different type of conversation and look at some of these issues and around conflict from a different lens. And I found that to be helpful here and educational for a lot of folks.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The piece around just, needing to talk about it and address it before we even get there. I think we tend to wait until we're in the midst of it and it's at its highest, most escalated point before we actually start talking about it. Yeah. So that's part of it. Nika, any closing thoughts from you around that question?
Well, I was going to save this for one of a later question, but I guess I feel like still that, whenever we talk about conflict, just because of the history of the negative associations with the term, and whether it's the media, when the media talks about conflict, they're actually using conflict as a shorthand term for violence or war. Development agencies around the world, when they talk about conflict, they mean armed conflict. When you ask, and when I've done trainings and I ask and I, write the word conflict on the board and say, what's your thoughts? What are your first thoughts when you see the word conflict? What do you think of? It's all violence, war, aggression, and then it maybe gets down to, okay, disagreements, disputes, and every now and then, somebody might see, an opportunity. But I think the term conflict as it's used in general, is going to automatically put people focused on conflict, which is kind of present tense and past focused. And, how did we get here? What's the causes, et cetera. And so in my own work, when I'm, just to give an example with the gang mediation I've done, we focused on the language of peace. And I know that doesn't sound as hard and tough as the term conflict, but it was much easier for them to engage around the notion of we're trying to build peace in the community than to address and resolve conflict. And so because the term peace for most people has a positive connotation, and there's also different interpretations of peace. And when I use peace, I don't mean just the absence of violence, but also the presence of justice and the structural and cultural peace in the ways that Johann Galtung talked about, 20, 30 years ago. But notionally, you say peace and people have a warm, fuzzy feeling. And when you say conflict, people immediately tense up until they think more about it. So I don't know if I want to spend my time changing the language in the world around what people imagine when they hear the word conflict, and just find a word that already people can embrace and focus on the substance of what we need to be focusing on than trying to come up with new terms or better terms for existing issues and problems.
Sure. So I want to address two things, and then I'll take us somewhere else. So one is I'm now recognizing a real distinction between how we talk about conflict in the United States versus the rest of the world, and so there may be a real difference there. And I'm also thinking about in the context of organizations where conflict is often under the table, not discussed. It's sort of there and people are aware of it, but they still might feel like they're operating in a very peaceful environment. So, kind of what do we do with that where it's more under the table and less overt? So I want to introduce, and so Nika, feel free to challenge this, but the article that we posted on our website does offer a framework for conflict engagement, and pulling from academic literature uses this academic definition of engagement around three things. So essentially, to be engaged in something means to be involved in it, that you're willing to perform that task, to be energized by it, in other words, that you're motivated to perform the task in some way, and to be enthusiastic about it, that you have a deeper interest and desire to perform the task. So if we apply that to conflict and have this conflict of engagement, or this framework of conflict engagement where you're involved in conflict, you're energized and motivated by it, and you're enthusiastic about addressing conflict, how does that maybe change people's attitudes and approaches to it? Everyone's quiet, so I'll start with you.
I mean, Rick, I think that, one other way I look at conflict is like I look at the way people think again is, I think sometimes that we all have what I would deem to be limiting beliefs. And so when we have limiting beliefs, and you can view conflict as a way of having a limited belief, you have to change it. I mean, whether you change the, and I'm challenging Nikki now, whether you change the word, whether you embrace a new word that you already use, there still have to be a shift in the way you communicate and how you engage the conversation in order for people to make a better approach towards conflict. You know what I mean? And there's no way around that, because if you look at now all of the things that's happening in the world, even today, unless there's a shift in the way we think and the way we act and towards whatever we do, including conflict, it's going to remain the same. And so we have to have some kind of way that we continue to normalize something that I don't think worldwide, internationally, that people are really are doing. I've been in every continent in the world. So, and I see a similar situation worldwide. So you have to have some kind of way to continue to normalize that. And give you a quick example. I mean, one thought that I have is that people are quick. If a computer breaks down now, as far as I'm concerned, and it become inoperative, that's a conflict. But people perceive that computer breakdown. Oh gosh, let me just figure out how to repair this computer and get it back online. Boom, no problem asked. But now two people get into an argument. Oh wow, you're gonna have a flight or fight. A whole total different situation.
So let me jump in here for a second, and I appreciate that point. And Ralph and Sam, I've heard you both kind of use the phrase, we have to normalize conflict. And Nika, I think one of your approaches was to frame it around not conflict, but frame it around peace. And let's look at that end state that we want to get to, rather than kind of where we are now. So what other, kind of shifts do you see people making, that are sort of more productive and lead to more effective ways of addressing these issues?
Here at TSA, we've, most of the last 10 years of my life has been here. So that it's fascinating to hear Ralph and Nika talk about the international and kind of other work that they've had. But we've really seen a strong impact from coaching. And I think there's a coaching culture that's slowly starting to take root here at TSA. We're starting to do more providing coach-like skills training for frontline managers. More of our teams, folks on my team, have gone through coaching training. And I think it's about framing potential, conflicts or challenges or issues as goals to solve together. How can we both support one another on this? Similar to, it was a kind of aha moment for me to hear Nika's story around framing that conflict as a piece of really changing the language, and I think changing the kind of the bigger picture of what we're after, and it's how we're framing these issues. And I think coaching has really helped people, one, look at their issues through a different lens. And I think one of the most important things around coaching is accountability and ownership of the issue. That if they start to develop that accountability and ownership, that they can have control of it, and they don't need to turn it over to somebody else to deal with it, they themselves can manage it. There's confidence in that, and there's more willingness to reach out to somebody to resolve something. Because we really struggle at TSA with over the last several years, seeing a big incidence or a big rise in folks not even wanting to engage with one another at we call it the lowest level, just to have that informal conversation, but filing EEO complaint, filing a workplace grievance. They have those grievances and workplace EEO complaints have skyrocketed because I think people have just lost confidence in each other and just find it easier to turn their issue over to a third party per person for them to make a decision. So coaching, these TSA talks, it's about kind of bringing the conversation to the people to help think globally here on how we deal with this.
Yeah, one of the things that I appreciate about that, and then Nika, it sounds like you wanted to jump in, is and I hear TSA talk about that a lot in the work that I do with that agency, is bringing the conflict to the lowest level possible. And I think I hear that at other agencies as well. And, as a way of normalizing the experience, recognizing that there is conflict at the lowest level. So why not try to address it there rather than waiting for things to escalate to the point where there's formal grievances or there's, even that escalate to litigation. So, it sounds like and TSA is using coaching to kind of give people, in addition to bringing it to the lowest level, giving people a set of skills and a level of support that they can use to address things when they occur.
It's just easier. There's just, I think it's the core issues, and I'm sure, Nika and Ralph have seen this in their work. It's just this lack of trust, and really with TSA, I think, and some of the work that I've seen, is just lack of an infrastructure or a system that can really support that trust at the local level. Folks are just trying to figure it out themselves, and I think without that trust and that level, that feeling that you can walk up to somebody and try to work things out, then it's just you're looking at different avenues to resolve your issues. So it's conflict avoidance, which leads to just turning much. I think sometimes a much more detrimental impact by not having that conversation with the person. It's more exacerbated. We've seen a lot of kind of negative impacts from that.
Okay.
So I wanted to just piggyback on a couple of things that have been said. I agree completely with Ralph that, we have to have a culture change, and culture change influences language, and language influences culture. So we always need to be mindful of that. And that means being context specific, the language and the culture where we are, and whether it's in an organization, in a country, in a city, and whatever, being mindful of that. And as Sam was talking about the work at TSA, it made me think also that coaching is part of capacity building. And so whether we're talking about managing conflict, resolving conflict, preventing conflict, transforming conflict, really what my focus is trying to empower the people, whoever they may be, to understand and analyze their conflicts and then see a path forward together. And that third, us as third parties don't have to be the ones to fix things. And I see, so whether it's through training, education, and also even if you are intervening, I'm working with a group now that is leadership in an organization that have a lot of internal conflicts, and that's filtering down into their workforce. And so as we're talking about their issues, we're focused, me and my co-facilitator, we focus a lot on having them, we present a tool and have them apply it to their conflict, to understand their conflict, to be able to, think about where do they want to go, what's their vision for the future, identifying barriers to that vision, et cetera, et cetera. So it's about capacity building. I think when you talk with people about wanting to build capacity and the ability to handle the challenges of life, that encourages them to engage as opposed to avoid. The one thing I did want to say just about the term engaged and engagement, and should we say conflict engagement? My initial reaction reading the article was like, great, I'm used to the language of employee engagement, and that's, a new common term being used, and we're trying to get people to be more engaged. But then I also realized, you look at the dictionary definition of engaged and engagement, it's often related to to, like in Webster's dictionary, it's, you know, besides being engaged, meaning to be married, it also, the first definition was involved in an activity, occupied, busy, greatly committed, interested, and number 4 was involved especially in a hostile encounter. And so we have the term military engagement, or to be engaged in conflict, engaged in combat. And so the term engagement in and of itself is not a normatively positive concept. It can be used either way. ISIS would probably say they're very engaged. They're in their conflict. You know, they're very enthusiastic and energized and involved. And so I'm not sure if we start using the language of engagement or conflict engagement, that gets us any further than where we are.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and it's interesting to think about it in those other frames. So, for example, to be married to conflict, you know, I've certainly encountered people in my own life that seem
sometimes feels that way.
Yeah, very interested in keeping the conflict going. You know, and so the place where I really want to get us is what are those language shifts? You know, what are those other ways that we need to kind of talk about conflict differently than we're talking about it now? And, you know, I think we've addressed some of those, but if there's, you know, real specific examples of changes in language that the three of you can think of, you know, I think that's worth sharing. What are those?
I don't know if it's as much changing in language here. I think Ralph mentioned this too, around kind of, you know, talking about this cultural shift that needs to happen. And I think it's, you know, some of the work that we've done here at TSA, Nika's worked a lot with us at TSA, and you have Rick as well. I think it's looking for unifying opportunities. So in some of the recent work that we've done, you know, this group came up with, they came up with some norms around how they were going to engage with each other in the workplace. It was a kind of list of 8 or 9 norms, and everyone had it posted up in their cubicle. And that became the kind of, like, it was a unifying kind of approach to say, not really around conflict resolution or conflict management, just how we were going to kind of engage with each other professionally. Another colleague who did DISC training, the communication styles training, everyone put their DISC style up, and to let people know, hey, this is my style, and this is your style, and how we can, and this is the optimal way to approach me. So I'm wondering if it's less about language sometimes, and just some of the activities, some of the actions that we can do as organizations or in our work as practitioners to set people up for having those constructive conversations and having more effective, meaningful engagements, and not being afraid of the conflict, looking at that kind of proximity to the kind of seed of discontent as a conversation, as a jumping off point, as a catalyst. So, I mean, yeah, those are just some thoughts around some of the things that we're doing here. I think the language, Nika, I think you mentioned like 70 words around conflict. It's true. I don't know if I have more words myself, or.
Well, the one that comes to mind is just the notion of change and change management.
Yeah.
As conflict at its essence, to me anyway, is somebody's it becomes in conflict, if you want to use that way. It's because they want some kind of change, or they feel like something is happening and that they don't like, and they want to change that, or something is happening that's being thrust upon them, some change that's coming externally. That they don't want. I just did, even in my community, and going to the community associations where I live, oh my gosh, there's people who've been living in the community for their entire lives, and they're in their 60s, and they don't want the change that's happening, that, happens inevitably when new people move in, and then the new people coming in, change can't happen fast enough, and that's creating a conflict. So it's a matter then, how do you manage that change process? Because as we've said, conflict is inevitable. Well, change is even more inevitable. And it's how we address and deal with and respond to change that I think is, determines whether or not it's going to be constructive or destructive.
Mm-hmm. So I want to highlight a couple of things that I heard, and then Ralph, I want to come to you as well. So for one, it sounds like a shift, rather than talking about conflict, talking about it in terms of change. What is the change that's happening now? What is the change that we maybe want to see, and kind of framing the conversation that way. Sam, you talked about kind of behavioral norms and developing those. And I think in my own experiences and helping others address conflict, I realized that, developing a good set of skills and behaviors that people can be comfortable with does help keep conflicts from escalating, and taking the fear out of it. I think, really developing confidence and competence in the skills that we have does kind of, help us feel less fearful and more willing to step into that conflict space. Ralph, anything from you?
Yes. Well, what happens for me is it's another question, and the question becomes: is there a model, or can there be, or are there models that we can come up with that deals with conflict change, or peace change, or communication change, or so that's where I'm at. My question even becomes further: what type of primacy or constructed models of conflict change that through research that we could come up with, and those models, and the reason why I say model, because one model does not always fit. Because every conflict, there's different levels and different types of conflict, and different organizations, different individuals, and different cultures. So from my perspective, if we had models of conflict change or intervention or prevention, I think we might even see that the language or the use of different language could actually benefit us more. And then if those models would be more not on the negative side, but be more on the positive side, or effective models, I think then we have a way or roadmap to maybe make some impact both on an individual and a collective level of what we might say a systems approach. So I think if we had a model, and that model was a systems approach, I think we have a way that the systems approach would invite and embrace the language change, and also I think it could even embrace a cultural change of conflict. But we have to have a model, because people don't follow just language, they also follow models.
So thank you for that point, Ralph. And one of the things that I was thinking of throughout the conversation is, there's a way that we talk about conflict, but then there's also the processes that we engage in as a means of resolving. And I know I have my own kind of go-to processes and models, but I'll, Sam and Nika give you a chance to respond to that as well, if there's any, particular framework that's particularly useful for you.
But at TSA, we had something called the Integrated Conflict Management System, and it was in place for about 10 years. We were unionized back in 2012, and things shifted. So there's some remnants still in place. But I think, to Ralph's point, the beauty of what I saw in that, because I actually ran our conflict coaching program when that was really kind of in its heyday. There were places, ways, and means, a lot of them, for employees to raise their issues, from anonymous boxes to employee advisory councils to a lot of, we call cooperative problem solving training, doing a lot of train the trainer, and building capacity everywhere. And it was a unifying experience for everybody, because although each system could be different and had its own spin at each airport, there was kind of overall architecture supporting everything, and kind of a roadmap for everybody. We wanted them to make it their own. However, at the end of the day, if you were in Alaska or if you were in Georgia, running this program at an airport, you could count on basically the same kind of components for the system. And I think it really gave people an outlet. So I agree. And I'm kind of in I'm in a 2.0 phase here at TSA, trying to crack the nut. But I agree with Ralph that a system, it's a unifying experience when people feel like, and they know they can trust something. I think there's safety in a system as well. So without that system now, it's become a little bit more ad hoc. So I think if you have potential to create a system or bring a system in, then we really found success with it here.
So I'm going to take the conversation back to the language a little bit, because I've received a question from someone who's viewing live. And so that question is, the use of metaphor is often helpful in addressing conflict. So what metaphors have you used or found particularly helpful? Getting a lot of crickets there on that one.
Well, for me, so I live, I'm down in DC now at headquarters here in Pentagon City, but I live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I grew up on the ocean, and we're right on the ocean up there. So my metaphor is around really tides. We have some pretty crazy tides up in that area of New England. And I think for conflict, that like conflict, tides are inevitable. They're going to come and they're going to go. They're going to be bigger. They're going to be smaller sometimes. And I think the more we can kind of become comfortable with knowing that there is the inevitability of these tides, and then even more so, how to maximize and optimize our experience in the tides. I enjoy surfing and other water activities. So really kind of taking time to get into the tide, to get into the water and play around and understand its nuances is helpful, because it's going to give you more enjoyment, and it's a way to kind of maximize the inevitability of conflict or of, as I say, a tide. So.
I'll piggyback on that one, because that's actually similar to one I use, also referring to the tides in the ocean, because I love to go to the beach. But, Ralph mentioned earlier the fight or flight response. And so everybody's familiar with that. And when I talk about the tides, I talk about, in order to keep from drowning, what they say is, instead of trying to fight the waves, is to go with the flow. And I do my little, go with the flow, and meaning that, it doesn't mean that you let it happen, but that you work with the force of the tide to get yourself out of the situation. So that's one of the metaphors that I use. But I've used things like, the caterpillar turning into the butterfly. There's a lot of metaphors.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that gets to the transformation, which is a word that you used in a conversation we had offline. Conflict transformation, and how that became popular in the literature for a while. One metaphor that's coming up for me is a colleague I used to work with many years ago. Always used to talk about a can of gas, and she'd say, I can use the can of gas to fill up my lawnmower and come over and mow your lawn, or I can come over and set your lawn on fire. And the can of gas is, it's nothing more than this neutral thing, but the attitudes, the intentions, the approaches that we, bring to it really influence kind of the actions that we carry out. So I think we're kind of coming to the tail end of our time here, and I know that some folks have to run. So I want to kind of just quickly wrap up here. Is there any, what's one quick tip that the three of you have to help people kind of, address conflict meaningfully in their own lives?
Well, my tip, Rick, is kind of the same thing I use myself. Is I truly believe that when people have a conversation, that if they will have a constructive conversation and keep their voice tone at a kind of like the tone that we all are using here on this webinar, and the conversation is more what I call a calming conversation, like a well. When I was in the Navy, I used to sit on ship and I would listen to the sound of whales in the ocean. And so it was very calming. And so I think when people have conversation, if they have a more smoother, calmer conversation, then the conversation can be constructive. And then as a result of that, the conversation, you'll have a big picture conversation, and people will understand each other, not necessarily agree, because you get two people together, you're always going to have some disagreement, but you can have an understanding and a peaceful conversation. And that's important. And I think if people do that, they will have a better situation and will communicate better, but don't always look for agreement.
Okay. Thank you, Ralph. Sam?
I use CYA, check your assumptions. I think that assumptions can get us in a lot of trouble. and just the kind of concept of assuming positive intent, which is not always easy, but even if you're not assuming positive intent, just to take some time to really check in and clarify that what you have, the construct you've developed in your mind, is actually that other person's truth, or the group's truth, or whatever the situation might be. So to really use the open-ended questions, active listening, those skills to get down to the matter, to make sure that your kind of mindset is in the right place and aligned with the other person. And I think it's not always easy right off the bat, and I use this a lot in coaching, is just to kind of think through triggers and hot buttons, your own and the other person's, and to put yourself in that other person's shoes and to kind of ask some of the questions of the things that you might be doing to impact the other person and your kind of role in the situation where you find yourself. Because I think it's so easy to just, it's all their fault, it's all their fault. At some point, you're in that conversation, you're in the meeting too, you're in the situation too. So to really kind of do that self-reflective piece.
Great, thanks, Sam. And Nika?
I'll just add be inclusive. That means listening to others to understand and speak, when you speak your own perspectives and your own truth, to speak it in a way that helps other people understand you, to be visionary, think outside the box, or where are you trying to get to instead of focusing on where you've been, although we need to also be analytical to understand where we've been so we can frame and shape our future, and be passionate about people and the planet, and that we're all here in this together. So we might as well make the best of it and, be more peaceful in our approaches regardless of what the situation is.
Great. Thank you all. And I'll say that for my own, I started this conversation. I do think language is very important. So I encourage our audience to pay attention to your language and be, very choiceful about the language you use, because it holds a lot of power. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. So Ralph, Nika, Sam, thank all three of you for joining us today in our conflict conversation. I want to let our audience know that this session is being recorded. It will be accessible on our website at adrvantage.com, so you can view it or share it anytime you want. Also, please share your thoughts, feedbacks, or any questions that did not get addressed today by submitting them to ADR Vantage through our website or on social media, or by sending an email to workbetter@adrvantage.com. Any questions that we get, we'll submit to our panel and post those responses to our social media page, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Be sure to follow us on those sites to stay up to date on our latest news at ADR Vantage and to get updates on when our next conflict conversation will be. On behalf of ADR Vantage, I want to thank our three guests, Dr. Ralph Steele, Dr. Nika Carstarphen, and Sam Slosberg, and all of you who tuned in today. So thank you, and we'll see you in our next conflict conversation.
Thank you very much.
Good to see everyone.
Goodbye.